History is full of parties meant to celebrate love, power, peace, or pure luxury. Instead, they ended in stampedes, riots, betrayals, massacres, and enough royal stupidity to keep history books entertained forever. So here are 32 insane parties where the music stopped, the wine spilled, and everything went catastrophically gloriously wrong. 1. When Louis XVI, still just the future king, married Marie Antoinette in 1770, Paris decided the obvious way to celebrate eternal love was with fireworks. Because nothing says romance like explosives near a giant crowd. The whole thing was badly managed from the start, and then one rogue firework shot into the main supply. Instantly, the sky show became one enormous explosion. Panic ripped through the crowd. People were crushed against barriers, trampled underfoot, and shoved into the Seine trying to escape. More than 130 people died at what was supposed to be a glittering royal celebration. So yes, the marriage of Louis and Marie basically opened with chaos, fire, and public death. Which, in a darkly impressive way, was a very on-brand preview of where their story was heading. Not exactly the fairy tale launch the palace had in mind. 2. Getting invited to one of Emperor Elagabalus's parties in ancient Rome was not a compliment. It was more like being selected for an expensive, deeply unwell social experiment. The teenage emperor had a talent for turning luxury into nightmare fuel, and one of his most infamous dinner surprises involved rose petals. At first, it must have seemed elegant. Perfumed petals drifted down from the ceiling, guests probably smiled politely, and for a moment everyone thought, wow, this tyrant has taste. Then the petals kept falling, and falling, and falling. The room started filling up with them until people could not breathe. Guests were literally smothered under a mountain of flowers. That means Elagabalus found a way to weaponize romance decor. It is horrifying, ridiculous, and weirdly inventive all at once. Most rulers killed with swords. This one apparently looked at a bouquet and thought, yes, but what if murder? 3. In 8th century China, and Lucian had mastered the art of being the guy everybody loved at a banquet. He was charming, funny, trusted by the imperial court, and famous for throwing lavish gatherings where everyone relaxed around him, which is exactly what made him so dangerous. Behind the smiles and easy charisma was a man preparing one of history's most catastrophic betrayals. At the height of his favor, he launched a rebellion against the Tang dynasty, kicking off a conflict that would devastate the empire and contribute to the deaths of an estimated 30 million people. That is not a bad vibe shift. That is a civilization-level plot twist. He basically used his reputation as the fun, lovable insider to hide the fact that he was about to set the country on fire. Moral of the story: the life of the party is occasionally also the reason your dynasty collapses. 4. In 1921, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the biggest names in entertainment, the kind of silent film star whose face was everywhere. Then came one spectacularly disastrous party. Arbuckle hosted a 3-day hotel binge in San Francisco, complete with illegal booze, celebrity excess, and the kind of reckless atmosphere that usually ends with headlines and regret. During the gathering, actress Virginia Rappe became gravely ill and died a few days later. Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter, and the scandal exploded across America. Newspapers turned the whole affair into a feeding frenzy, painting him as Hollywood depravity in human form. Even though he was eventually acquitted after 3 separate trials, the damage was already done. His reputation was wrecked, his career shattered, and his name became a cautionary tale. One ugly weekend did what years of fame could not. It erased him from the top. 5. Harold Bluetooth, the Viking king whose name somehow ended up on your wireless gadgets 1,000 years later, understood that a feast could do more than honor the dead. In the 10th century, he hosted an enormous funeral banquet for his father, which sounds respectable until you realize he also used it as a political ambush with ale. He invited rival leaders, filled them to the eyebrows with drink, and waited until grief and alcohol had turned everyone into soft, emotional clay. Then came the clever part. In their drunken haze, he got them to swear loyalty to him. So they arrived expecting mourning, food, and enough mead to forget their own names, and left having casually handed him power. Imagine waking up with a pounding head, a blurry memory of toasting the deceased, and the sudden realization that you may have pledged away your independence between rounds. That is not a funeral. That is strategic intoxication. 6. Truman Capote's black and white ball in 1966 did not leave a trail of corpses. It left something even more terrifying to high society: humiliation. Fresh off the success of In Cold Blood, Capote staged the most exclusive event in New York, inviting just 540 people and making a simple envelope more powerful than a crown. The party itself was dazzling, masked, elegant, and dripping with prestige. But the real disaster happened outside the ballroom. Thousands of rich, ambitious, status-obsessed people did not get invited, and that omission hit them like a social execution. Entire circles dissolved into paranoia. Friendships soured. Alliances cracked. People obsessed over who made the list, who did not, and what that said about their rank in the food chain. Capote did not merely throw a party. He detonated an ego bomb in the middle of elite society and then watched the fallout in evening wear. 7. The Duchess of Richmond's ball in Brussels on June 15, 1815, may be the most inconveniently interrupted party in history. It was a glittering evening packed with British officers, aristocrats, diplomats, and all the polished people who enjoy dancing while Europe catches fire nearby. The atmosphere was elegant, relaxed, and full of that dangerous pre-disaster confidence history loves to punish. Then word arrived that Napoleon, who was very much not done being Napoleon, was advancing with his army. The room changed instantly. Officers who had been waltzing moments earlier were suddenly saying rushed goodbyes, grabbing orders, and preparing for battle. Some literally left the ballroom in dress uniform to head into the campaign that would end at Waterloo. One minute it was a society event. The next it was the prelude to one of the most famous battles in European history. That is not a party killer. That is history kicking the doors open. 8. In 1971, the Shah of Iran marked 2,500 years of the Persian Empire by throwing a celebration so extravagantly detached from reality it almost feels fictional. He built a luxurious tent city in the desert near Persepolis, imported enormous quantities of gourmet food from France, and flew in tens of thousands of bottles of wine for a guest list packed with royalty, presidents, and dictators. Everything gleamed. Everything cost a fortune. Everything screamed, "We have lost all contact with normal human life." Guests dined in absurd luxury while many ordinary Iranians were dealing with poverty and hardship. The event reportedly cost hundreds of millions of dollars and became a global symbol of royal excess. Instead of strengthening the monarchy, it made the regime look arrogant, lavish, and oblivious. In a spectacular act of political self-sabotage, the Shah basically hosted an ultra-exclusive palace fantasy that doubled as free advertising for revolution. 9. In 1120, William Adelin, heir to the English throne, boarded the White Ship with the energy of a rich young man who had never once been told no in a way that stuck. He and his noble friends turned the voyage into a floating drinking party, got thoroughly drunk, and then, because bad ideas love company, challenged the king's ship to a race. At night, in dangerous waters, full speed ahead. It was a masterclass in privileged stupidity. The ship smashed into a submerged rock and sank almost at once. Nearly everyone aboard drowned, including William himself and a huge chunk of England's young aristocratic elite. Since he was the only legitimate male heir of King Henry I, his death triggered a succession crisis that spiraled into years of brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. So yes, an entire kingdom was destabilized because one drunken prince treated medieval sea travel like a boat drag race. 10. Alexander the Great conquered an empire stretching across much of the known world. Yet one of his most infamously stupid decisions seems to have come not in battle, but at a party with too much wine and not enough adult supervision. After taking Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, Alexander and his companions celebrated with a victory feast that went completely off the rails. According to ancient accounts, the courtesan Thais urged him to burn the city as revenge for earlier Persian actions against Greece. Deep in his cups and apparently thrilled by the suggestion, Alexander grabbed a torch and led the drunken destruction himself. Just like that, one of the ancient world's most dazzling cities went up in flames because a conqueror at a party decided arson sounded fun. Imagine sobering up after that. A hangover is one thing. Realizing you torched a world treasure because you got reckless in public is another. 11. The Astor Place riot of 1849 is proof that fan culture did not begin on the internet. It was already completely unhinged in the age of Shakespeare. The chaos started as a feud between supporters of two actors, the American Edwin Forrest and the British William Macready. Apparently, New York audiences were so emotionally invested in theatrical rivalry that they treated it like a blood oath. When Macready attempted to perform at the Astor Place Opera House, Forrest's supporters turned up not merely to boo, but to unleash chaos. The crowd hurled stones, smashed windows, and transformed an acting dispute into an urban siege. Authorities called in the militia, because of course they did, and the soldiers opened fire on the mob. More than 20 people were killed. Overacting. Over Hamlet-adjacent ego warfare. Theater lovers today may post long, dramatic opinions online, but in 1849 they escalated straight to paving stones and live ammunition. 12. The Bradley Martin Ball of 1897 was what happens when extreme wealth meets catastrophic self-awareness failure. New York was struggling through hard economic times. People were poor, unemployed, and furious. So naturally, the Bradley Martins decided this was the perfect moment to stage the most outrageously lavish costume ball America had ever seen. They transformed the Waldorf Astoria into a fantasy version of Versailles and invited the elite to show up dressed as historical royalty, because apparently, Read the Room had not yet been invented. Guests paraded around in jewels, silk, and powdered absurdity while the public watched the rich cosplay opulence during a depression. The backlash was immediate and savage. Newspapers ripped them apart, ordinary people seethed, and the family's reputation imploded so badly they eventually left for England. They did not just host a tone-deaf party. They managed to offend an entire city so thoroughly that America basically responded, maybe go be unbearable somewhere else. 13. The Ball of the Burning Men. In 1393 sounds like the title of a terrible medieval festival, and somehow the reality was even worse. King Charles VI of France and several noble companions decided to entertain the court by dressing up as wild men for a masquerade. Their costume strategy was spectacularly suicidal. They covered themselves in pitch and attached flammable fibers to their bodies, turning each dancer into a walking fire hazard with aristocratic credentials. The one rule, and it was not a complicated one, was that nobody should bring an open flame near them. Enter the king's brother, late, drunk, and carrying a torch because apparently disaster needed a personal assistant. One spark was enough. The costumes ignited almost instantly, and the celebration became a screaming inferno. Several men died horribly. So yes, this royal party ended because a group of powerful adults looked at tar-covered outfits and thought, absolutely safe, let us dance. 14. Going to a private gathering hosted by Prince Felix Yusupov in 1916 turned out to be a deeply unfortunate decision for Grigory Rasputin, though not for lack of effort on the killer's part. A group of Russian nobles lured him to a palace with food, wine, and every intention of removing him from the political equation. The first plan was poison. They gave him cakes and wine packed with cyanide, enough to finish off something much larger and angrier than one Siberian mystic. Rasputin ate and drank with alarming calm, then simply did not die. So the conspirators panicked and shot him. He collapsed, then reportedly got back up and tried to escape, which is the kind of moment that makes assassins reconsider their life choices. More shots followed, along with brutal violence and finally a trip to the river. It was less a smooth execution and more a chaotic group project from hell. 15. In 1934, Adolf Hitler demonstrated that his idea of hospitality was identical to his idea of politics. Lure people in, smile briefly, then ruin their lives. He invited Ernst Röhm and other leaders of the SA to what seemed like an ordinary gathering at a hotel, the sort of meeting where powerful men might expect coffee, conversation, and maybe some light plotting. Instead, it became the opening act of the Night of the Long Knives. Röhm and others were arrested, many were executed, and the whole affair served as Hitler's brutal purge of real and imagined rivals. The genius, if you want to call it that, was in the setting. It was not a battlefield or a public showdown. It was a friendly meeting that turned into a trap. The lesson is chillingly simple. When a paranoid dictator invites you somewhere casual, it may be best to suddenly become extremely unavailable. 16. Harthacnut, the Danish king who also ruled England, managed one of the most brutally awkward public deaths in royal history. In 1042, he was attending a wedding, which is already a risky place to stand up if you are the sort of person expected to give a formal toast. He rose with his drink in hand, presumably ready to say something noble, heartfelt, or at least polite. Instead, he suffered what was likely a stroke or seizure and collapsed dead on the spot. Just like that, the celebration of two lives joining together acquired a dead monarch in the middle of it. Imagine the bride and groom trying to process that. One moment it is music, ceremony, and polite smiles. The next, a king has turned the reception into a national crisis. He did not merely kill the mood. He obliterated it with the efficiency of a man who managed to make someone else's wedding permanently about himself. 17. Eric of Jutland attended a royal funeral feast and apparently decided that mourning was a competitive sport. Medieval funerals for nobles were not exactly quiet affairs. They often involved serious drinking, long rituals, and the kind of heavy atmosphere that encouraged people to honor the dead with alarming quantities of alcohol. Eric took this to a level that feels almost satirical. Instead of simply grieving, he drank so hard and so relentlessly that he died of alcohol poisoning during the memorial itself. He quite literally attended one funeral and became the reason people needed to plan another. That takes commitment, terrible judgment, and a body that finally said, absolutely not. There is something almost grotesquely efficient about it. Most people leave a funeral with a headache and emotional fatigue. Eric left with an immediate reservation in the afterlife. If excess had a patron saint, medieval royalty would be making a very strong case for canonization. 18. In 1440, two powerful young Scottish earls were invited to dine with the king in what must have seemed like a promising political olive branch. A nice feast, some courtly manners, maybe a chance to smooth over tensions. Instead, they walked into one of the bleakest dinner twists in medieval history. The meal proceeded normally enough until a black bull's head was brought in and placed before them. In 15th century Scotland, this was not subtle symbolism. It was basically the host announcing, without raising his voice, that your evening plans had been revised to include death. The boys were dragged out shortly afterward and executed. The event became known as the Black Dinner, and its mixture of hospitality, ceremony, and sudden betrayal was so chilling that it later helped inspire the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. Which means history once again proved that medieval nobles could outdo fiction without even trying. 19. Attila the Hun terrorized empires, crushed armies, and built a reputation so fearsome that people called him the Scourge of God. So naturally, history rewarded all that menace with one of the least heroic endings imaginable. In 453, after celebrating his latest wedding with a huge feast and an equally huge amount of alcohol, Attila went to bed heavily drunk. During the night, he suffered a severe nosebleed and, too intoxicated to wake up or react properly, apparently choked on his own blood. That was it. No last stand. No battlefield glory. No flaming arrows. No grand speech. No dramatic cavalry charge. Just a wedding night, too much drink, and a nose that picked the worst possible moment to malfunction. For a man who spent years making the world tremble, it is almost offensively anticlimactic. History sometimes writes epics. Other times it takes the most feared warlord alive and ends him like a very unlucky man at a bad reception. 20. Peter the Great treated parties the way other rulers treated prisons, armies, or interrogation rooms. For him, a feast was not relaxation. It was a loyalty test wrapped in alcohol fumes. He created the all-joking, all-drunken synod, a grotesque parody of a religious order in which nobles and officials were expected to take part in endless drinking rituals, vulgar ceremonies, and humiliating performances. The man at the top of this ridiculous institution wore a chamber pot as a hat, which tells you everything you need to know about the tone. Refusing to drink, slowing down, or trying to preserve your liver was treated almost like insubordination. Participants could be forced to swallow monstrous quantities of vodka from oversized goblets designed less for enjoyment than punishment. This was not a fun royal club. It was state-sponsored debasement by hangover, a system where your endurance for humiliation and alcohol became part of your political resume. 21. The wedding of Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre in 1572 was supposed to calm religious tensions in France by bringing Catholics and Protestants together in one grand ceremonial show of unity. On paper, it looked like progress. In reality, it was one of history's most grotesque bait-and-switches. Paris filled with Protestant nobles who arrived expecting celebration, diplomacy, and perhaps the beginning of a less murderous future. Instead, just days later, the city exploded into violence. The attempted assassination of Protestant leader Gaspard de Coligny helped trigger the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and what began as a targeted attack quickly turned into a widespread slaughter. Wedding guests became hunted men. Streets ran with blood instead of post-reception gossip. A ceremony sold as reconciliation became a nightmare of political and sectarian betrayal. It is hard to imagine a more catastrophic collapse of the phrase, "Let's all come together." France managed it with bells, vows, and mass murder. 22. The final gathering in Jonestown in November 1978 was called a White Night, but there was nothing ceremonial or celebratory about it beyond the cult language forced onto it. After members of Jim Jones's inner circle murdered United States Congressman Leo Ryan and others at a nearby airstrip, Jones knew the end was close. So he assembled his followers for one last act of obedience dressed up as revolutionary purpose. What followed was mass death on a horrifying scale. More than 900 people, including many children, died after drinking cyanide-laced grape drink or being forced into the process. It was the culmination of manipulation, isolation, fear, and psychological domination. This was not a weird party anecdote from history. It was the final stage of total control exercised by a cult leader who had spent years reshaping reality around his followers. The event remains one of the clearest and darkest warnings about blind devotion ever recorded. 23. The Banquet of the Chestnuts sounds like something your grandmother might host in autumn. The version reportedly staged in the Vatican in 1501 was very much not that. Associated with Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, and a man who treated moral boundaries like optional decoration, the evening followed a lavish meal with entertainment that shocked even people living in the Renaissance, which was not exactly a shy era. According to later accounts, 50 courtesans were involved in a bizarre contest featuring chestnuts scattered across the floor, and spectators from the highest levels of church society. Prizes were allegedly awarded based on performance because once you have already bulldozed past dignity, you may as well add scoring. If the reports are true, the whole thing unfolded in the Apostolic Palace itself. That means one of the most scandalous, indecent party stories of the age happened inside the very headquarters of Western Christianity. History occasionally has zero respect for symbolism. 24. Adolf Frederick of Sweden achieved a strange immortality in 1771 by becoming the king most famously defeated by dinner. He sat down for what can only be described as a royal assault on digestion: lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, and champagne, an already reckless combination before dessert even entered the scene. Then came the semla, his beloved cream-filled pastries. Not one or two, which might be forgivable. Not even 6, which would at least show ambition. He reportedly ate 14. At that point, this stopped being a meal and became open warfare against his own internal organs. Soon afterward, he died, earning a place in history as the monarch who effectively consumed himself into oblivion. For a king, it is an unusually domestic end. No assassin, no battle, no coup. Just a table full of indulgence and a digestive system waving a white flag. Somewhere between pastry number 13 and 14, fate probably muttered, "Enough." 25. Tycho Brahe, the brilliant 16th century astronomer who mapped the heavens with extraordinary precision, was apparently no match for one very earthly problem: needing the bathroom at a banquet and being too polite to do anything about it. According to the long-told story, Brahe attended a formal dinner where etiquette dictated that guests should not leave the table before the host. A normal person might have quietly excused himself and preserved both dignity and bladder. Tycho, however, chose the path of lethal courtesy. He reportedly held it for far too long, developed severe complications, and died days later, likely from an infection related to urinary retention. So one of Europe's great scientific minds, a man who could calculate celestial movements, was undone by the social rulebook of a fancy meal. It is one of history's cruelest little jokes. He spent his life studying the stars and may have died because nobody at dinner wanted to be impolite. 26. The Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520 was presented as a glorious diplomatic summit between Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France. In practice, it looked more like an 18-day competition to determine which king could spend the most money proving he was not insecure. The site was packed with lavish tents, rich fabrics, extravagant clothes, fountains flowing with wine, tournaments, feasts, music, and enough theatrical excess to embarrass a modern billionaire. Every detail screamed wealth, prestige, and very expensive ego. The point was supposedly friendship and peace between the two monarchs. The result was mostly showmanship, empty pageantry, and a truly breathtaking burn rate for cash. Worst of all, it did not even work. Within a couple of years, the two kings were at war again, making the whole event less a diplomatic breakthrough and more the costliest Vanity Fair in Europe. An 18-day flex, basically, with no useful sequel. 27. The Erfurt latrine. Disaster of 1184 is one of those historical events that sounds invented by a very immature demon, yet it really happened. A crowd of German nobles gathered in Erfurt for a political meeting, all packed into an upper-level room of a church-related building. As medieval elites do, they were probably discussing land, power, feuds, and other cheerful topics. The problem was structural and also very literal. The wooden floor could not handle the combined weight of so many armored aristocrats. It gave way beneath them. Falling through a collapsing floor would already be awful, but the room below was not a hallway or cellar. It was a giant latrine pit. Dozens of nobles plunged into a mass of human waste, and many drowned there. So a gathering of powerful men ended not with a noble resolution or dramatic duel, but with counts and lords dying in sewage. History can be majestic. It can also be absolutely feral. 28. Henry II of France decided to celebrate peace in 1559 with a jousting tournament, because apparently nobody had yet suggested that letting armored men charge each other with lances might not be ideal entertainment for a diplomatic victory party. The king, being confident and fond of display, joined the event himself. Everything seemed fine until his final tilt. His opponent's lance shattered on impact, and one jagged splinter shot upward through the visor of Henry's helmet, piercing his eye and driving into his brain. The scene instantly shifted from festive pageantry to royal catastrophe. Henry was carried away in agony and lingered for 10 days before dying. So the host of the celebration managed to mortally wound himself during his own entertainment program. It is one of history's clearest arguments for safer event planning. Peace treaties signed, tensions cooled, and then the king accidentally turns the party into a nightmare by trying to impress everyone on horseback. 29. By 1837, Andrew Jackson had a problem inside the White House, and that problem weighed around 400 pounds. It was a giant wheel of cheese that had been sitting there for 2 years, steadily developing the kind of smell that could probably file legal paperwork. Rather than solve this quietly like a normal person, Jackson chose chaos. On his final day in office, he opened the White House to the public and basically announced free cheese for everyone. The crowd charged in. People hacked off chunks with knives, shoved greasy slabs into pockets and hats, and turned the presidential mansion into a dairy battlefield. The cheese vanished in about 2 hours. The odor, however, remained behind like a curse. Curtains, carpets, and walls absorbed the lingering ghost of old cheddar so thoroughly that the smell haunted the place for weeks. Jackson did not host a farewell reception. He unleashed a cheese riot and left the next administration to breathe through it. 30. Belshazzar's feast is the ancient benchmark for reckless party arrogance. The Babylonian prince hosted a massive banquet for 1,000 guests and apparently decided basic blasphemy would make the evening feel more upscale. To impress the room, he brought out sacred vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem and used them for drinking wine while his guests praised their gods. In other words, he turned stolen holy objects into partyware, which is generally not a great move if you believe the universe might answer back. According to the biblical account, it did. A mysterious hand appeared and wrote words on the wall that nobody could understand. Daniel was called in to interpret the message, and his translation was essentially divine termination paperwork. Belshazzar had been measured, judged, and found wanting. That very night, Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians. He did not just throw a bad party. He managed to turn one banquet into the closing ceremony of an empire. 31. For generations, Westminster School in London celebrated Pancake Day with a tradition that sounded festive until you remembered boys are fully capable of turning breakfast into combat. The setup was simple. A cook would toss a giant pancake over a bar, and then the students would launch themselves into a violent scrum to seize it. In theory, this was a game. In practice, it was a compact riot with uniforms. Punching, kicking, wrestling, shoving, and general chaos followed as boys fought over one greasy object and a small cash prize. That means people were risking bruises and broken bones for a pancake and some pocket money, which is either hilarious or a deeply troubling summary of civilization. The event carried on for more than a century because institutions are sometimes impressively slow at noticing that annual child brawls might not build character in the best possible way. Apparently, one carbohydrate was all it took to peel away manners and reveal pure savagery. 32. The Winter Palace Ball of 1903 was the Romanov elite at their most dazzling and most delusional. Guests arrived in breathtaking 17th-century costumes, dripping with jewels, embroidery, velvet, and enough decorative excess to make a museum feel underdressed. The imperial court basically staged a fantasy of old Russia, dressing up as a grander, safer version of the past, while the real empire around them was becoming unstable, angry, and increasingly unmanageable. The photographs are gorgeous, which only makes the whole thing more unsettling. Everyone looks magnificent. Everyone looks doomed. Within a few years came revolution, upheaval, and the destruction of the world they were so elegantly pretending would last forever. That is what makes the ball feel eerie in hindsight. It was not just a lavish event. It was an elite class attending its own farewell party without realizing it. Glittering costumes, smiling faces, and the future already sharpening knives outside. So after all that, one thing is clear. Give humans power, ego, alcohol, and an audience, and they will eventually turn a party into a disaster. Now go to the comments and make your case. Which historical party disaster did we miss, and who was the absolute dumbest host on this list? Hit like, subscribe, and stay here for more history at its most ridiculous.